Okay, we're recording this session. Thank you all for attending. Lee Jones with you. Our discussion today is to look at the Constitution, but we need to look at the history of the Constitution. What is a Constitution? Now, remember, let me show you something else. I was going over this with a previous class. You might find this accessible. What we're saying this semester is, at least the early part of the semester, we were defining what political science is, right? And so we said that politics is about power. The word science involves the use of a method to understand power. So political science, then, at bottom, no matter what else it is at least the methodical and systematic analysis of power. Okay. What is power? We said that power, that there's various dimensions to this concept that we call power. Choice, change, space are three of the dimensions that we're using for this class. And so what then is power, just in general form? In general form, power is the ability to influence the choices that are made by others. Power then is the ability to influence choice. Well, what are the choices? Uh-oh, do I not have the screen shared? Hold on. I'm looking at the screen. It says I have the share button. I believe I'm sharing the screen. Am I doing that right? All right. All right, good, good, good. So, hey, Tanner, click around, see if you can see it, right? Or maybe he's talking about the discussion post. Oh, okay. Isn't the discussion post visible now? Hold on. Wait, I'm going to show it to you. Discussion post. This is module 4. Here we go. All right, so here's the thingamajig, and that's it there. I click that button. That's off, and that's on. So it should be on there, right? So you should be able to see it. Or if not, you can't post. Okay. All right. Well, let me work on that right after class. I'm gonna stay in the swing here, right? I'll work on the discussion part. Feel free to, right before I stop, feel free to put that in there again and remind me. I have to talk about the Constitution. Get carried away. I like the Constitution. All right. Power is the ability to influence choice, but we're saying that the choices that matter are those that deal with the allocation of scarce resources. The choices that matter are those that deal with the allocation of scarce resources. Famously, Harold Laswell wrote, "Politics is about who gets what, when, and how." So how are you going to determine who gets what with those scarce resources? Indeed, what's the word scarcity imply? The word scarcity means that you're not going to be able to achieve maximum satisfaction. No one is going to get all of what they want. Even in a system in the United States where you have such wide disparities of uh, uh, income and wide disparities of the resulting power that comes from it, right? We live in a country where Charles Koch, Koch, is worth $50 billion. And then I can go downtown Atlanta and see dozens of people living under 75, 85, right? And so if you have such wide disparity in income distribution, there's going to be scarcity. Even though Charles Koch has $50 billion, he's not going to have everything that he wants, right? He's still going to want more. So scarcity is the inability to achieve maximum satisfaction. And so because no one is going to receive satisfaction because everyone is going to want more than they have, you will have conflict in the United States or in your country. And so the purpose of the government then is to try to deal with that conflict. So the goal then of a constitution is to divide power. I said all of that to say the Constitution is that core, basic, foundational document that divides power in the society. It says who's going to have what kind of power. The Constitution says you're going to have, for example, the U.S. Constitution says you're going to have 3 branches of government. It says that the federal government is going to be distinct from the federal government. It says that the state government are also going to yield rights and liberties to the American people. And the Constitution is going to say what powers the states have, what powers the federal government has, and what rights the people have. So the Constitution is a core basic document that divides power. Now, let's say a few words about where the Constitution comes from. Quickly, my main goal today is to through the Declaration of Independence. One more time, this class is called American Government. We have done our work on theory. We have done our theory work what was that, last week? 70s of Democracy. We have done our work in reading Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau to look and a bit of Montesquieu to talk about the Enlightenment period and the primacy of social contract theory with the attendant terms popular sovereignty and inalienable rights. We have also defined our terms in terms of looking at what the word power is. So what we have left to do now is, this class is called American Government. We have to get to know the Constitution. To get to know the Constitution, I guess we could be arrogant and just straight up open up the Constitution, right? In fact, unless I closed it a second ago, I do have your Constitution sitting right here. But we're going to approach the Constitution with a certain amount of reverence. Let's go ahead and investigate it and investigate it right, just as if I wanted to know one of you. I see Gracie Smith there, right? If I really wanted to get to know Gracie Smith, sure, I'd have a conversation with her, but that's what she's going to say about herself. In order to really get to know what Gracie Smith, who she is, I'm going to go and talk to her mother, talk to her father, go find her grandparents, right? Going to go talk to her people, the people or the community or the area that she comes from. Or we're going to talk to a community that socialized Gracie Smith into being who she is. So in order to get to know the Constitution, then we have to get to know where the Constitution came from or the antecedent events to the Constitution. Let's take a few of them one by one. Now, really quick, right? Here, now, I'll say it this way. You take class from another political science guy, then you take this class from somebody else, then they'll start with other things, right? Depends on the the grad school really the guy came from and whatever, however they were taught about it. But so these are my antecedent events. And of course, you're in my class, so maybe some of this makes the test, maybe it doesn't. But I would have you note the Magna Carta from the year 1215. You'll remember that King John, right? King John at the time was essentially autocratic. Remember that any king needs to have a good relationship with the barons. The barons are the landowners. The masses of the people in the state work the land, and the baron is able to move those workers from the farm into the army. So the barons then are essentially the military leaders, the people who had control over the army. And King John at the time was being autocratic, making rules up as he went. And so the barons essentially said, hey, if you don't change your practices, we're going to wage war against you, have a civil war. And so King John says, okay, well, I have to accept then that the people have some power over my ability to make laws, to make rules. Well, what do you call it where the people are the source of power for the government? That's called popular sovereignty. So even before the term popular sovereignty was used by Rousseau, 500 years earlier, the Magna Carta is an example of popular sovereignty where King John is moved by, indeed, the lords and the barons to sign off on the Magna Carta, right? A limit on his power. However, that didn't last. You remember this is your Robin Hood act, right? But King John ultimately betrays those barons, and then the barons are moved by the French, and you got a civil war. All right, the first Barons' War, got a civil war. Okay, so I'm offering the Magna Carta as an early example of popular sovereignty. Let's move forward another couple of hundred years. This is not your history class. I'm not your history professor, but we're going to do a little bit of history just to put our understanding of the Constitution in historic context. I use this map to talk about the voyages of Christopher Columbus. Do you need me to tell you in the year 2020 that Christopher Columbus does not, I say does not, discover America? How do you discover something where there are people already there? In order for you to say Christopher Columbus discovered America, you have to qualify your terms and say he discovered America for Western Europe during the time period that they traveled, because keep in mind, the Vikings had come across the Atlantic earlier, and the ancient Africans had come across the Atlantic even earlier than that. I am citing uh, Ivan van Sertima cinemas, they came before Columbus, where he looks at Olmec heads in Mexico. You can Google those just to see what we're talking about. But no, the voyages of Christopher Columbus, that barbarian Christopher Columbus, let's get at him. The genocidal maniac Christopher Columbus. Are you a Christopher Columbus fan? I'm criticizing your guy. Christopher Columbus's ultimate contribution, if he didn't discover anything, his contribution is that he opened up transatlantic trade routes. He opened up transatlantic trade routes to allow European corporations to exploit the labor and the land, yes, the labor of people in the new lands that he was to travel to. Okay, right? So Christopher Columbus opens up transatlantic slave routes. I didn't mean to say slave. I meant to say trade routes. That slavery is on my mind, but transatlantic trade routes. Let's move forward. Okay, so here is, Portugal, right? This is Portugal on the side of Spain, even though it wasn't called Portugal then. And by 1526, just looking at the map, by 1526, the Portuguese had come to what would be called the American, well, what would later be called the South Carolina. The Portuguese had come and established a slave plantation. Ergo, the first European slave plantation is established in 1526. Pause button. You will remember that we started this class off by looking at the 1619 slave experience, where you have the first Africans from Angola brought to Jamestown, Virginia. However, we know that in 1526, this is the first time you had enslaved Africans brought to the what's called the Western, what is this place called? North America, right? All right, so what distinguishes 1526 from 1619 is that the place that folks landed in 1526, that did not become the United States. This was a Spanish colony. The Spanish colony was ultimately defeated by the British, and then the British colony becomes the United States. So what happened in 1619 is the first enslavement that happened in the area that becomes the United States. In 1526, this is the first time Europeans brought Africans enslaved to North America. Well, at least that part of North America. Now, I'm offering this to you as an antecedent to the American Revolution, which would happen 200 years earlier, because in 1526, by August, you have the establishment of the plantation. But by November of 1526, what happened? The Africans rebelled. They burnt it down. They destroyed it, along with other elements at work. But essentially, the first evidence of slavery is simultaneously the first evidence of a rebellion by enslaved Africans. Hear this from me now. This is not your history class, but I figure, seeing how I'm on the point, I might as well be crystal clear. The history of slavery in the United States is the history of rebellion and resistance. It is not the history of docile Black folks just sitting down taking it, right? I am motivated because over the weekend, Donald Trump said he's going to remove funding for the teaching of the 1619 project, right? And so clearly some of that still needs to be taught. All right, let's move on. We go from 1526, let's jump forward another 100 years to 1620, and let's think about together the Mayflower Compact. You remember the Mayflower Compact is an early example of contract theory, because they stopped the ship before it docked and they said, let's come to an understanding. We've been on this ship for multiple weeks together and we know each other, and we know that in the next couple of months we'll have a problem with each other if we don't agree to some type of governing structure. So what happened was the families that were represented on the ships, they elected a family member to be the one who would sign off on the Mayflower Compact on behalf of the rest of his family. What do you call it where one member is chosen as a representative to sign for the others? That's called republicanism, where he becomes the elected representative of the family. So what we have in the Mayflower Compact is an early example of republicanism and also social contract theory, because they're agreeing to a governing structure, sacrificing some of their rights to allow other people to, allow this governing structure to protect the rights that they're not willing to give up. That's right, Haley. What we're seeing here is an early example of representative democracy or republicanism and social contract theory. These antecedent events to the American Revolution, or antecedent events to the Constitution from 1620. Let's not a big jump, but just a little itty bitty skip forward in time, and let's go to 1628, where King Charles the First asked Parliament for additional tax money to support the war. In order for him to get that money, the British Parliament made King Charles sign something called the Petition of Rights. And this Petition of Rights is an early forebear to some of the things that found their way into your Bill of Rights. Amongst this Petition of Rights from 1628 said you shouldn't have any cruel punishment. We'll come to find that in the Eighth Amendment. You have the right to bear arms as early as 1628. That's in your Second Amendment. And then you have the right to ask your government to do things or stop doing things to you, or the right to petition your government for a redress of grievances. And that's what you see in the First Amendment. So the Petition of Right is an early example of the Bill of Rights, right? Grant Williams, we'll get to that in just a second. Was it King Charles who broke England out of the traditional church to let himself divorce? You know, that's not how I use these folks. So how I use them is to talk about where the Bill of Rights and the Constitution from. I would have to look. I do have a really good book over there, but I'd have to look that up. Let's keep forward, right? From 1628, let's go to 1689. Not the Petition of Right, also, but move forward to the English Bill of Rights. What happens here is that one of the kings, James II, is overthrown, and so his predecessor, his successor here, is made to sign off on this Bill of Rights to say that many of the things that James II did cannot happen without the consent of Parliament. And so in the English Bill of Rights, 1689, we see some things: cruel and unusual punishment, right? Freedom from fine forfeitures without a trial, freedom of speech in Parliament. We see some other things that found their way into the Bill of Rights. We keep on going. This is not your history class, but a few minutes, if you please, on the history immediately prior, or the antecedent events to the U.S. Constitution. We're coming here to the 7 Years' War. Now, remember, we are right at the time period. We're right before the time period of the American Revolution, right? Between 1754 and 1763, you have the British and the French engaged in military conflict. This military conflict is being waged not only, in the English Channel, but in the colonies that were beholden to both the English and the French. So some historians will call the 7 Years' War not the first, but an early world war, because you have British and American colonial forces engaging each other around the world. The 7 Years' War is important for two reasons. I would have you put this in your notes. The 7 Years' War was important for two reasons. Number one, the 7 Years' War, British wins, the Brits win, and they are saddled with a debt. They have a certain amount of debt that they pay that it took them to win the war. They had a debt. They needed money after the 7 Years' War. And then second thing I want you to keep in mind, the 7 Years' War is where George Washington gets his military experience, and even though he particularly good, but he gets a certain military operation, and in a couple of, a decade or so, that's going to be, he's going to need that. The 7 Years' War. Now, speaking about the debt, why do, imperialists, why does a country grow colonies? Why does a country go and take colonies, right? The purpose of having a colony is to extract resources, both human and material and intellectual, from the colony, right? An extractive economy, Anthony says, right? So the goal is to take that Hey, Grant Williams, there is debate as to, George Washington, the father of the country, why was he chosen to be general over other people over the American Revolution? There is considerable debate that a young George Washington was not a particularly, uh, you know, good military officer. The second reason for the 7 Years' War is that George Washington gains military reputation here. George Washington, right? The first one because it saddles the British with a debt. Now, why does a empire grow colonies? To extract resources from them. This picture map here is just over the course of time the number of British colonial holdings that they had around the world, right? The famous phrase was that the sun never sets on the British Empire because they had colonial holdings all over the place. So the purpose of a colony is to extract wealth. Now we are in the time period immediately antecedent to the American Revolution. All right. So by the 1760s, the American colonies were 150 years old, right? This is not a new thing that they were revolting against. This is a generational system that they were revolting against. The British elites had drafted into power a series of American elites by common ties, by marriage ties, but absolutely by economic and political relationships. The British elites had created a set of American elites to facilitate the colonies, but there was a certain amount of tension that emerged. What we just said a second ago was that the 7 Years' War saddled the British with a debt. And then the British, because they are the empire, they wound up, I'm going to use the phrase, making economic impositions onto the American colonists. Economic impositions. So amongst these are the various declaratory acts, right? Well, not declaratory. Let's say intolerable acts, right? So you have the Sugar Act. In short, this is not your history class, but I just wanted us to be clear about some things. In short, the Sugar Act is a tax on it is a tax on sugar, but it's a tax on luxury items. Who can afford luxury items? Those who are wealthy. But it's also a tax on liquor and dice and such also. We'll talk about that in a second. The Stamp Act of 1765 is essentially saying that in order for a piece of paper to come from a government and be official, it has to have the stamp of the British Parliament, and that stamp was, the price for that stamp had increased. So it increased the cost of doing business for legislatures. Who runs legislatures? The lawyerly class or the elites. So that's something else. You have here the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act of 1765 essentially says in the name of the British Empire, they can come knock on your door and give you 15, 20 minutes to vacate the premises to allow the British troops to come inside your house. This is something that the homeowners in the metropolitan areas, you know, Philadelphia, Boston, and the like. This is something that they found particularly distasteful, right? And then you have the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act, in short, says the British Parliament has the ability to make laws that the American states or colonies have to follow. So all of these things, when you put them together, yes, the Third Amendment does talk about that. All of these things, when you add them up together, you have the British economically imposing themselves on the American colonists, and the Americans wound up, getting upset about that, right? I think it might not be too far to press the point where, there were taxes being placed on literally all the things that folks wanted to use, right? If you are going to if you're going to tax dice and playing cards, and liquor while you're at it, who's sitting around getting drunk and, you know, gambling? I'm looking for a particular book to wave in front of you. Well, that's going to be the working class, right? Oh, I wonder who's going to go forward and staff your military. Yeah, that's going to be the working class. Okay, so with the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, that was essentially a tax on luxury items. I cannot find the book that I'm trying to show you. What I wanted to wave in front of you was this book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, by Lowell, but it's hiding from me. I know I got it here somewhere, but it is hiding from me now. All right, well, let's keep it moving. All right, that's enough. All right, I can't find it. So let's keep it moving. So what you have here is that if you're taxing legal documents, you're upsetting the educated class. If you're taxing luxury goods, you're upsetting the wealthy. And if you're taxing dice, playing cards, and liquor, then you are taxing the poor and the working class. So essentially, when you add it up all together, this set of economic impositions made it hard for the British to have peace. They were just doing something to create their own crisis. And then when you top this all off, you have an identity crisis that was occurring in the American colonists, right? The American colonists said, wait a minute, look at how you folks are treating us. We've been subjects to the British crown for 150 years, but we are not we're glad to be British, right? We're not Spaniards. We're not Dutch. We're not Portuguese. We are subjects of the British crown. And look at how close we are, right? If we are not, if you're treating us like we don't matter, huh, you're treating us like we're just regular colonialists. And if we're not British, then who are we, right? And then when you add this identity crisis along with the economic impositions, and then you also, because this is America, you also have to factor in racial conflict, right? Remember, if you're taking a holistic, or nowadays the phrase is an intersectional approach, you're going to have to acknowledge that there's some racial conflicts that are at the present in this country. And we're not even talking about slavery at this point. What I'm bringing to you is the proclamation of 1763. Remember that American colonists were using something called the white man's burden, along with something called manifest destiny, where they were looking to expand from the Atlantic Ocean as westward as they could go. I just mentioned to you that, what's his name? Christopher Columbus didn't discover anything because there's all kinds of people, in particular Native American people, living in this territory. And when the colonists were expanding, they were brought into conflict, and indeed military conflict with Native Americans. And so military conflict, Native Americans are organized to really do something about it. In many respects, they could actually push back and do raids on lands that were held by the colonists. What you had was the British, King George III, the British government said, well, wait a minute, this fighting is interrupting our ability to extract wealth from these colonies. So what we need to do is, what he does essentially is proclaim that colonists should not be able to go past the Appalachian Mountains. Now, American colonists said, wait a minute, you are taking the side of Native American, and we're going to use the word savages on purpose here, right? I'm going to show you the Declaration of Independence in a little while, somewhere. I'm going to show you the Declaration of Independence in a second. And you will find that they were using, indeed, Thomas Jefferson used the phrase savages on purpose in your Declaration of Independence. Merciless Indian savages, right? And so the settlers say, hey, you're taking their side against us. You are betraying us. And then, not to put too fine a point on it, you are betraying us, white people, for those Native Americans over there. And so that just increased the tension. So I'm ending the first part here. My argument for you here is that economic impositions, a crisis of psychological identity, along with a certain amount of racialized angst, increased the tension between the American colonists and the British, and that leads to fighting. Now, let's keep going. I got more pictures for you. The Daughters of Liberty began to organize themselves as we move forward in this telling of history. Remember, the Sugar Act says essentially that it would increase taxes on luxury items like fine clothes. The Daughters of Liberty says, you know what, we don't have to get our clothes from Savile Row or from London. We can make our clothes and create some branding, current term, around things that are happening in Philadelphia, right? Things that we can make in, Boston. The Daughters of Liberty are joined by the Sons of Liberty. And here you see a depiction of the Sons of Liberty. This is one of my favorite pictures here. You see, this is called the Liberty Tree. I don't know if you could read it, but that's what that says. You have the Stamp Act placed on the Liberty Tree, but it is upside down, as if to say that there's something wrong with it. And then you have the Liberty Tree producing some Billie Holiday style strange fruit. You would think that the Liberty Tree would produce apples, oranges, peaches, but the Liberty Tree in this telling is producing a noose, Billie Holiday style, right? And then you see in the background the Boston Tea Party. Here you have the American colonists, and they are tarring and feathering a tax collector. How do you tar and feather a guy? This is a treatise that was conjoined with the times. Strip the guy naked, heat the tar until it is thin, pour upon the naked flesh, or rub it over with a tar brush, after which sprinkle decently upon the tar, whilst it is yet warm, as many feathers as will stick to it, as if you've got your pinky out when you're doing it, as if you are baking a cake. No, you're stripping the skin off that guy with hot tar and feathers, right? And so this is something that was done to the tax collectors. And so I'm just moving forward. By the time you get to the 1770s, you have a certain amount of revolutionary fervor, you have a certain amount of sheer anger, of psychological angst, of racial, I don't know, privilege being challenged, and then you have a march on the docks. A march on the docks in 1770. You have dock workers confronting the British military, essentially saying, hey, you are taking our jobs, you are making things hard for us to live our life. We are protesting against you. And then there is tension. They are eye to eye. They are looking at each other. They are heated. There's different stories. That's why I got a whole bunch of books over here. There's different stories that could you could use to say what happens next. But the story that I like is that there's a bottle thrown at a young lieutenant, a young soldier rather, and this young soldier, already shaken by the confrontation, here it is, shaken by the confrontation itself, this young lieutenant fires a shot. Bow. And who does he hit? I'm mentally quoting from this book here, Lies My Teacher Told Me. His name is James Lowen. Essentially, this young soldier, he shoots Crispus Attucks. So what? Why is this significant? Crispus Attucks Crispus Attucks was a black guy. And killing Crispus Attucks is essentially one of the shots that are heard round the world. Shots heard round the world. And so when you shoot Crispus Attucks, you are starting the American Revolution. That's seen as one of the starting points of the American Revolution. Uh, Crispus Attucks then is one of the first people to die in the American Revolution. What's the American Revolution going to produce? It's going to produce freedom for the United States from Britain. Wait a minute, a black guy in the 1770s dies for the freedom of a country that would not give his people freedom for another couple of 100 years? That's exactly what we're talking about. Now, pause button. You know, my son, okay, literally, he's right down the hallway right now. He's in class himself. But, he goes to this school up there in Boston, and it's not like I'm in Boston at all since young years, I used to drive around a lot, but nowadays I stay in the house. So I don't get to Boston often. So I was in Boston. I had a rented truck there, and I was driving around, and I was like, you know what? Before we get on the road, I'm gonna go find where Crispus Attucks was killed. Google, you search it, and then I found this spot. And this is one of my favorite pictures, right? Because essentially what I did is I stopped the car. It was like in the middle of the day. There's mad traffic down wherever this place was, and I just stopped the car and put the blinkers on. They're beeping at me, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. I'm gonna go see where Crispus Attucks was killed. And so that's the story behind this picture here. This is the site where the Boston Massacre. This is supposed to be where Crispus Attucks stopped, right? And so they were mad at me, but guess what? They got over being mad at me 5 minutes after I drove off. But I'm telling this story 3.5 years later, whatever. All right, so moving forward, now you come to the Boston Tea Party, right? The Boston Tea Party is essentially instigated by Samuel Adams. We're going to refer to him as Samuel Boston Tea Party Adams. What Samuel Adams does, right? What Samuel Adams essentially does is he's a rhetorical genius. He's a person who had speech skills. He could talk and move men to action. That was the power of his oration. And so they have a meeting at Ye Old Meeting House, or the Old South Meeting House, And in certain points, certain tellings of the history, it doubled as a bar and a church. It is what it is, right? And so this is me. Now, I didn't stop the car. This is me taking a picture of it, holding my cell phone out the car, right? If I had dropped my cell phone, I would have stopped the car. But nope, that's me taking the picture driving by. Look at that. That joint came out relatively clear. Android Samsung. All right. So what Samuel Adams is doing here is he says, aren't you upset with these British people? Hey, we're upset. Go, go, go. They're drinking beer. All right, we need to go do something about this. Oh, we should go do something about it. Go, 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 go. We're drinking beer. All right. And they say, you know what? Let's go down to the harbor and let's throw the tea in the water. Yeah, let's go do it. Right. So the Boston Tea Party, December 16, right, 1773, the colonists go down and they just dump the tea in the harbor by way of economically pushing back against the British Empire. Now, what do we know about this? How were they dressed? They were dressed up like Native Americans. I forget the daggone tribe right this second, but they were dressed up like Native Americans. Now, if they're dressed up like Native Americans, we'd have to assume one or two things. We're told that the Boston Tea Party is a spontaneous action. It's something that just happened because, folks were just mad about it. But if they're dressed up as Native Americans, are we to assume that Boston citizens, white Boston citizens, just had Native American outfits in their bags? If we know that 130 people were involved and they dumped 90,000 pounds of tea, that means you had to have a few people there, right? And so if they weren't dressed up, if they were dressed up like Native Americans, then that means that somebody had to be there with a box of outfits talking about, here's your outfit, go here, passing out whatever a Native American outfit would look like. And so if someone had a box of outfits, then that means that the Boston Tea Party is not a spontaneous revolutionary fervor. The Boston Tea Party then is premeditated, right? The Boston Tea Party is an action that had been planned. And so what does that mean, that the Boston Tea Party may have been planned? I'm in books at you because I just like to do that. Here is one book by Howard Zinn, The Famous People's History of the United States. And then here is Howard Zinn creating an anthology of, people's comments, written. He's checking on the record here, right? And then let's look at what I'm calling from. I don't know if you can see this, but he definitely has a section right here on the Boston Tea Party. I am enjoying so much teaching from home where I can just wave my books around. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right? So this is what we're doing, right? Boom, hitting you with facts, sources, research. All right. Let's get it. All right, so that's that. Now, the Boston Tea Party, right? I'm gonna go for another 15 minutes or so. And don't when I stop the recording, don't go anywhere because I have to say something about my technique for today. This is a depiction of the blockade of Boston Harbor. So the British Empire says, oh, you guys want to be funny and drop tea in the ocean, right? And remember, so many pounds of tea was dropped in the ocean that this tea was washing up in the Savannah River Harbor during the American Revolution. So they dumped 90,000 pounds of tea. Is a lot of tea, right? And so the British Empire said, well, we're going to do a naval blockade of Boston Harbor. This thing here represents the ships, the British military ships. So, this essentially says that nobody gets in, nobody gets out. An economic blockade is a military act of economic aggression against a city to try to starve it of resources, both material and human, if they're going to push back against the British Empire. So where we're going here, you have the blockade of Boston Harbor, you have the Boston Tea Party, you have the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks, 1770. What we're saying here is you have some conflict out there, right? That's funny. Oi, bruv. Yes, very good, Haley. Yeah, yeah. Some tea might be still out there, right? And down in the bottom of the ocean. All right. So you've got tension, you've got stress, and then you have a test of the Enlightenment ideals, right? Economic determinism. If people are born free from their God, then they should be free to make money without having a colonial power. If you are related to the center or to the empire through 150 years of history, then maybe that should give you a certain amount of leeway. But here they are with the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, right? The Republican ethics stirs says that we should have the right to determine our own government if we're going to pay taxes to that government. No taxation without representation. Now, let me point out some individuals to you. Let me point this individual out for you. Some of these people are on your next quiz. I teach American government all the day, every day, right? And so essentially what I wind up doing when I'm talking about the Constitution is I ask folks, can you name 5 founding fathers? Very often, people cannot name 5 of the founding fathers of this country. There's like the strict list is like 150 of them. Name one founding father besides George Washington. That's your daddy. You should know him, right? But name one. And oftentimes I see you, Gammon, and Stephanie, but a lot of times people can't even name one. So let's go ahead and be clear on some of these people, right? Let's call Thomas Paine. I want to call him the father of the American Revolution. Thomas Paine is the father of the American Revolution. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I got to apologize. I don't know what's going on, but wait a minute. That says Payne, but absolutely, this man's name is Paine. So I don't know. Maybe that's something that the daggone computer did when I hit the button, right? So Thomas Paine, William Smith. All right. So Thomas Paine is called the father of the American Revolution because in 1776, he published this pamphlet that would go on to inspire people to join the American Revolution. That pamphlet published by Thomas Paine is called Common Sense. John Adams, another of your founding fathers, the second president of the country, John Adams once said, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. That is to say that if he didn't write that to motivate people to join the army, George Washington wouldn't have had an army. Thomas Paine, the father of the American Revolution. Let's think about Samuel Adams. Remember, Samuel Boston Tea Party Adams, cousin to John Adams, Samuel Adams, who inspired people, who rather whipped people up into a certain amount of revolutionary fervor to want to do something about the economic impositions that were made upon them by the British. Here you have John Hancock. You'll remember that your Declaration of Independence has a set of signatures at the bottom. And while other people were signing their signature in a more rational, in a more humble fashion, John Hancock wrote his signature all big on the paper. Indeed, his name, John Hancock, becomes analogous to the word signature by itself. John Hancock is a financier. He owned a fleet of ships. He was able to use those ships to bring goods in and out around the blockade. If you are transporting ships around blockades, right? If he's doing something that the governing structure of the day says is illegal, then there's a word for that. And let's go ahead and use it. So I want you to, so you can remember it on the quiz. John Hancock is a smuggler. But of course, he had a certain amount of money and he was able to use that money, especially in the early years, to finance the American Revolution. Let's go from Samuel Adams to John Hancock. 10 minutes left. Let's approach the radical Virginia attorney, Patrick Henry. Remember that the states had to agree to join the American Revolution. That the American Revolution is not a foregone conclusion. You had to make arguments to make state legislatures agree to commit troops, both regular and militia, to fight the British. So Patrick Henry is giving a speech in front of the legislature, and he says, is life so dear or is peace so sweet to be purchased at the price of chains and liberty? He says, forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, Patrick Henry says, give me liberty or give me death. give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry. And then you have Paul Revere, right? Paul Revere is always interesting to me because he is placed in a strategic point to do reconnaissance on the movements of the British Empire. What is the group of military actors that do forward level reconnaissance to go ahead and watch enemy movements and report on enemy troops? We call that, yeah, okay, spies, but aren't the group of people that do that called special forces? Not scouts, but something more specific, right? Special, I like to call him special forces, right? So Paul, special forces Revere, Jack Black. I have no account on what that picture looks like. What Paul Revere does is when the troops are moving, he's supposed to run from town to town, from ultimately to, I believe it's Lexington, to the home where John Hancock and Samuel Adams are. And he goes from town to town warning that the British are coming, the British are coming, right? So Paul Special Forces Revere. So at this point, you have the American Revolution getting ready to kick off. You have military conflict at Concord. Essentially, the British had a weapons depot that was in between a town. The American militia, or the Minutemen, heard about this arms depot, and they said, let's go raid it. One of the snitches in the Minutemen, or a Tory, someone who was aligned rather, excuse me, with the British military, said, "Hey, the Minutemen are getting ready to run on those weapons." And the British military said, "Let's go meet them." And that's right, Haley, a snitch, dimes out the militia, the Minutemen, and so you have military conflict at Concord. There's a certain push and a pull to this conflict. Forces fall back, and then you have more conflict in Lexington. Once you've got fighting at Concord and at Lexington, then it is clear that you're getting ready to have a revolution. What the American colonists wound up doing was saying, that rather the Continental Congress said we need to establish peace and security so that we can get back to making money. But once you have conflict at Concord and Lexington, you're not going to have any peace anymore. And so you say, well, we're getting ready to have a revolution. And then how do you draft a set of reasons for that revolution? Then that's called, or the reason why the Declaration of Independence was written. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence. All right, now I'm going to stop this recording. Don't go anywhere yet, but I'm going to stop this recording. And thank you for